And if you all just heard that, you'll know also that we're recording the session so that it can be shared for people who couldn't make it today afterwards. This is a welcome to everybody who's joining us and coming in. We're going to wait until a couple of minutes after the hour to allow people time to get through the Zoom sign-in process, but welcome. Again, welcoming people who are joining us. We're going to allow a couple of minutes for people who come to the link and realize that there's a little bit more information to fill in on the Zoom sign-up sheet than they realized and don't want to miss the opening remarks. So we will wait just a couple of minutes before we get going. And the session is being recorded. Again, this is just welcoming everybody who is joining us. We will be starting in another couple of minutes. We're allowing a little bit of time for people to fill out the registration form, which for those who are still not entirely used to these things might come as a little surprise and just takes an extra minute or two. So we're just giving people the chance to sign up and get in so that they don't miss any of the session. A very warm welcome to all the people still joining us. We'll be starting in about a minute. It's very good to see people still coming in. And yes, we have a very good idea. While we're just, as the numbers are still coming in, and while we're waiting, we're going to put this brief moment to good use so that we can get a little bit of a picture of who is joining us today. So we're going to ask you some simple little questions. We've got a few polling questions. The first one, if you'd like to fill it out, is what sort of field of work are you in? Just click, and then we'll get an instant sense of who is joining us today. What sort of field of work are you in? Research or academia, media and comms, government, third sector, NGO, non-profit, or private sector? Just click on the box. We're not allowed to vote on the panel. You should be seeing that box on your screen. Feel free to tick a box. Let's see how it goes. I've got another question we're going to throw at you about, there we go, lots of people from research and academia and lots of people from the third sector as well, and a few from the private sector. Next, we're interested in how much you are familiar with the subject that we're going to be talking about. How would you consider yourself as an expert in sufficiency? As a novice, someone with some knowledge, or someone with some sort of pretty much expert knowledge? Just give a few seconds to click on that as people are still joining us. Thank you if you haven't already clicked. Do you have a click? We're going to should get a little bit of instant feedback there. Oh, that's pretty good. Some novices, some experts, but a good solid batch in the middle who've got some knowledge but interested in more. I think we will pause that there now and start the session. 5 minutes past. It's the people, 1 or 2 people still joining us, but it's leveled off. So you'll hopefully see some faces appearing on the screen. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Andrew Sims. I've been asked to introduce myself. So just to say, for want of information, I was one of the people who wrote the original Green New Deal way back in 2008, came up with a thing called Earth Overshoot Day, and more recently with my colleague, Professor Peter Newell from Sussex, proposed the other side of this equation of a treaty, a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to deal with the supply side. I run a think tank called the New Weather Institute. I'm Assistant Director of Scientists for Global Responsibility and coordinate an initiative called the Rapid Transition Alliance. And we run campaigns on issues to do with consumption and demand, which today's session will be dealing with. And when I've done a brief introduction, I'll just put a few links in the chat so you can follow up on any of those if you're interested in. Perhaps most relevant is a science oath, which is about committing to both system and behavior change coordinated by Scientists for Global Responsibility. We are recording this session, and so it will be made available afterwards. And we're here to discuss, in the wake of the new IPCC report, the question of demand-side interventions, or in layman's terms, how do we curb demand, and what the role of lifestyle changes and sufficiency is in the transition. So I'll set a little bit of context and then introduce our fantastic panel. So we're meeting in the wake of the most recent IPCC report, and in a year which has seen over the last 12 months temperature records broken, wildfires, melting ice, unnatural disasters, human displacement, and lives wrecked. And we have the challenge of the rapid decarbonisation of the global economy. And of course, when we're trying to cut carbon emissions, it is always said that scissors cut with 2 blades, both on the supply side, how we leave fossil fuels in the ground, and the demand side. And of all the options available to reduce human impact, curbing demand, certainly amongst that part of the human population that consumes far above sufficiency levels, should in theory be the easiest options. We have decades of research now showing that life satisfaction does not rise with more consumption beyond a relatively moderate level, and that your chances of experiencing well-being are just as good at 1 planet living levels of consumption as they are at 7 planet living. And we also know that many of the straightforward measures that would reduce demand, for example, the switch from renewables to fossil fuels, the switch from driving private cars to active travel and public transport, the switch to a more plant-based diet, the switch from disposable short-life consumer goods to a repair and remake economy, that all these things have huge additional benefits for health and well-being, as well as being necessary to reverse the climate and nature emergency. Now, we also know that in every sector, we've got proven examples and models for rapid transition. And that's one of the things that the Rapid Transition Alliance was set up to demonstrate, evidence-based hope, lots and lots of case studies on their website. But these things are not coming about in a systematic way. The dots are not being joined. And there are still siren voices pulling us in the wrong direction. You can open a magazine or walk down the street or watch any global sports event, and we're surrounded by adverts for sports utility vehicles, airlines tempting us with long-haul foreign holidays, all promoting and normalizing high carbon lifestyles. I remember watching one of the big 4 tennis open events recently, and the 3 courtside advertisers were a fossil fuel company, a car maker, and an airline. And these things have real effects, as been pointed out, that the shift in private choices in cars to SUVs, from just there being 1 in 10 of new cars bought to 1 in 4 in less than a decade, pushed by advertising, has been one of the big drivers in increasing emissions. And it's really good to see in the new IPCC report that things like the role of advertising and the need for it to be regulated is being recognized. But on the positive side, we're coming hopefully out of a pandemic, which has shown that when we act in the interests of public health and the public well-being, that we can make radical changes, both to systems and how we organize space in our cities, in how we organize our lives. We're prepared to go to great lengths to act in the interests of others. So today, hopefully, we'll tap into some of the things we can actually do about that. But to set us up today, we are going to hear from Leila Niamir, who's a computational economist working on energy and climate change mitigation and a research scholar with the IASA Energy, Climate and Environment Programme, who has been involved in the IPCC report. But we're also going to be hearing some respondents. We're going to be hearing from Doris Fuchs, who's a professor of international relations and sustainable development and speaker at the Centre for Interdisciplinary Sustainability Research at the University of Munster. We're going to be hearing from Elisabeth Dütschke, a senior scientist and since March 29, coordinator of the business unit Actors and Social Acceptance in the Transformation of the Energy System at the Fraunhofer Institute for Systems and Innovation Research, and also from Edouard Toulouse, who's one of the founders of Enough, which is the International Network for Sufficiency Research and Policy. Now, he's a consultant specialized in the energy consumption of products. So we'll hear first for about 15 minutes from Leila, and then shorter responses from our other speakers. And then there will be lots of opportunities for people to ask questions. If you have questions, I would encourage you to put them into the chat. Feel free to share any other useful links and information in the chat as well as we go. And feel free to put your questions in as people are speaking. But to begin with, let me welcome, I'm delighted to have her here, Leila Niamir. Over to you, Leila.
Thanks, Andrew, for your kind words, and hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So let me first share my screen. And also switching the right moment. Okay, perfect. So as Andrew mentioned, it's this time it's the first time actually we have a demand side and services as in a whole history of the IPCC. Basically, first time that we are talking about this as a particular chapter, and we had a very good team of the multi and interdisciplinary scientists that working in this topic. So I am here to happily just briefly discuss what we had as a latest assessment. The studies, I mean, the assessment shows that we are not really in a good way, in a good path currently, and basically we won't be able to reach to our target, which is 1.5 degree. However, the assessment shows that there is increased evidence on climate actions and technology and etc. So I would like to show a figure that shows that, as you see in a red basically line, as that if we take the 2020 policies basically and we continue as what we are doing now, will be above long from our goals. Basically, we will reach to the 3.2 degrees Celsius, which is really not a good way to do. And also in other scenarios, we can see that if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degree, we do need to peak by 2025, basically just in few years, and reduce about 43% by 2030. And if we want to take 2 degrees Celsius limiting, then again, we should peak emissions by 2025 and reduction by 27% by 2030. So this brings a clear message to us that we won't be able to reach to 1.5 degree unless we really do immediate and deep emission reduction. Of course, there is options available now that we can basically reduce emissions, half the emission by 2030. And this over the sectors is vary over the energy, land use, industry, urban, transport, and building. But the things that these in this cycle of assessment that we discuss and assess comprehensively, it's a demand and services, basically looking through the demand and putting the people and us in the center of this transition. Basically, changes to our lifestyle and behavior can reduce our carbon footprint, as well as improve our health and well-being. There is an untapped potential here that bring down global greenhouse gas emission by 40 to 70% by 2050, but only if the necessary policies, infrastructure, and technology are in place. In this assessment, we assessed several options, about 60 more actions or options for basically from the demand side. And just to give small notes that, for example, it was a systematic review that we did more than 50,000 literature to find out exactly what are the options and which are the has a major contributions to reduction of the greenhouse gas emission. Toward these basically options, I can point out to shifting or switching to walking and cycling, using electric transport, and of course reducing air travel and adopting our house basically on energy efficient materials, and shifting to the balanced plant-based diets. Also, in this assessment, we discussed that wealthier individuals have the highest potential for reduction. This could be as an investor, as a consumer, as a role model, and professionals. While there is while we do need this mitigation potential in many regions of the world, there is some places that they require additional energy, additional housing, and resource for human well-being. So in summary, to be effective, lifestyle changes will need to be supported by systematic changes across every aspect of society, including transport, building, industry, land use, or food consumption. This is the main figure of the chapter 5, which is focusing on the demand side mitigations. What we did actually in this figure or in this assessment, we tried to come up with the main options of the main demand side options, which has a major effect on a reduction of the climate change mitigation. And we categorized them in 3 main categories, which is one, it's a social cultural factors, is basically coming completely from the individuals behavior change, social norms, and all these things that is related to the people. Infrastructure use, basically how the existence of the infrastructure and using that could help to a reduction of the emission, and end use technology adoption. Since it is a really big figure, I'm going to focus on this. Basically, we're presented in a 3 panel. One, it's completely focusing on nutrition. The other one, it's a manufactured products, which is industry, land transport, and building, and other one industry. The light gray bar in all basically 3 panels shows the total projected CO2 emission in 2050. And then with the categories that I mentioned, social cultural factors, which is presented as a blue bars, we could reduce the emission by 2050. As you see in a panel A, which is a food, there is a huge changes through the social cultural factors, which comes from dietary shift and shift to plant-based diet and sustainable healthy diets. And this has a big portion and is coming from the social behavior perspective. And then the red bars shows the infrastructure use. Basically, for example, as an example, I can present in next slides that what we mean about the infrastructure use could be like urbans basically, or cities, city planning that helps for using the infrastructure or public accessibility to the public transport. And the last one, it's actually the technology, which would be energy efficient technologies, renewable energies like solar panels or energy efficient appliances that take up by end users. I will focus on a panel B and we'll discuss in next slide. But just before jumping to that, I would like also to little bit talk about the electricity panel. Why this is important? We show that based on a projection of the electricity in 2050, we have basically emission through the electricity sector, but also we have additional electrification through the electrifying the sectors, which comes from the industry, land transport, and basically buildings. And the beauty is that we show that taking the measures from the demand side measures from the industry, land transport, buildings, and also load management, we can exactly basically reduce that greenhouse gas emissions that comes from the additional electrification. And even we can go beyond that, which is actually, this is a good result out of these studies. But as I said, we are going to now focus on these three panel B, which is the three main sectors. And if you notice that I also highlighted around the land transport and building under the umbrella of the human settlement, because this is under the urbanization and the land transport and building could work. So, as an example of the industry, the main main social behavior or social cultural factors is shift in the demand towards sustainable consumption, like an intensive use of the long-lived repairable products, or establishing networks of recycling, repurposing, remanufacturing, and reuse of the metal, plastic, and glasses. And then other incentive or the infrastructure could be labeling the low emission materials and products. And the last but not least, from the technological perspective, we can say material efficient products and services and energy efficient and CO2 neutral materials. In a transport, actually, there is a very big message that reducing demand and low carbon technology are a key in this sector for reducing greenhouse gas emission. Active mobility through walking and cycling and teleworking and telecommuting is one of these social cultural factors. Shifting to the public transport, and shared mobility is another one that requires infrastructure, and electrical vehicles and all these new technologies that comes through the efficient basically vehicles. And from the aviation and shipping, of course, reducing the aviation or shift to the basically train, it would be a great options to say. But again, I'm saying that these public transport or shared mobility electric vehicle is completely also linked to the urbanization and urban or city planning, which we will talk in 2 slides. The next one, we are talking about the buildings, social practices resulting of energy saving, lifestyle and behavior change, basically how we are changing our behavior through our housing. It's has a big impact. Rationalization of the living space, architecture design, shift to the energy efficient buildings, envelopes, and appliances. and shift to the renewables or like a geothermals or solar PVs is another way to reduction. And there is a good message in the buildings that if we take all these things by 2050, we will able to by also renewable energy from supply side, we will be able to reach to the net zero. The last one, which is at cities and urban areas, that also is kind of under as an umbrella of this transport and building, we do need a better urban planning, sustainable production and consumption of the goods and services. As a one example could be a compact city that will give this ability for us to walk or to cycle to our destination. And basically all the services that we need is available in neighborhood, and you don't need to travel to other places. And the other important is in the green and blue areas. And actually that is very much trigger the behavior and lifestyle of the households and not only change the lifestyle of the household, but also brings more social cohesion and social practices, which is very important for human well-being. In this assessment, we show that clearly this report is hand in hand with achieving many of the sustainable development goals. And there is there is also another figure and assessment on basically relation of all these mitigation options from both the demand and supply to the basically SDGs or sustainable global development goals. But I would like to one step go further and talk about the well-being. In this figure, it's actually we tried with a big group of the scientists, we tried to take all these options that I just presented in previous slides in building, food, transport, urban, and industry, and see the relation of them with the well-being dimension. We recognize 17 well-being dimension, which is needs for human well-being, which is consists of the basic one like a food, water, air, to complete a social and a social perspective like a social cohesion, personal security, and etc. And also in a top row also I showed that the relation between these well-being dimension with basically the SDGs goal. And then we assess how is the relation of these options to the well-being dimension. As a clear message here is that there is a completely direct relation as much, and basically mitigating climate change or options for mitigating climate change is in line with improving human well-being. But maybe the question comes that the left side hand, we have a more relation or stronger relation. Why not in a social things? This is not coming from the less basically impact, but it comes from the lack of knowledge or information. There's a very lack of studies or relations to find out the impact of this mitigation to social perspective of the human well-being. However, we have strong studies on a basic human well-being. So this is a one research gap that we could look through it perfectly. To conclude, actually, I would say that we all do need, it's a time for action. We are just, it's a clear message from IPCC that we are much behind. And if we want to reach to the 1.5 degree, we should really do the action now, and in with deep emission reduction. And this could be basically through the different actors of the change is from the citizens, investors, consumers, role models, and professionals. And even we as a citizens, by bringing the social awareness and bringing the social norms, we can basically reduce the, bring this concept to also the political culture. And yeah, these are different ways that is as we do need the infrastructure, social trust, and some incentive and nudges to change these things. Also, I mentioned in my beginning of my presentation that the wealthier people could have a bigger impact because now they are more emitters, and then basically by avoiding and shifting and improving to the new way of the demand and lifestyle, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a really brief discussion about all these things. I'm happy to take also the questions, and looking forward to hear from my colleagues as well. Thanks for listening.
Leila, that was an absolutely fantastic whirlwind tour. Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask one quick question before we go on and hear from Doris about her work on 1.5 lifestyles. We had one question from a listener, just a technical point about how questions of uncertainty were captured in the graphs about how much reduction was needed. But also perhaps a question from me, because you very, very clearly pointed out the need to reduce aviation and shipping. And of course, sometimes these are things which happen at a global industry level. And certainly where aviation is concerned, the industry is committed to be getting much bigger in the coming decades. And in our sort of economic policy models, it's almost taken for granted that things can be manufactured anywhere in the world and shipped around the world. So on the one hand, I suppose it looks like there's some quite big sectors that need to be confronted, and also some fundamental questions about how the world does business, you know, taking for granted that it can ship things around. And I wonder, what's the next step about operationalizing these questions? Because of course the IPCC is constrained in terms of the, you know, specific political policy recommendations it can make. So how, now that we can see the way ahead, what are the next steps taken along that path from your point of view?
Thanks for the question. Actually, both of them is very, very good and relevant question. The first one regarding to the ranges and uncertainty. We did about lots of, I mean, the back of this figure is more than 100 sources. And then we figured out what actually these ranges comes from. And we showed the bars that shows the uncertainty. But basically, these are not uncertainty that we shows in things. These are ranges that we are saying, and then we take the median as which is with a high confidence that this has this amount of the reduction. But this is not a typical uncertainty that usually in IPCC is showing. This is a complete ranges. For example, we are saying between 20 to 70, and then maybe we will take around 50% as a median, which is a bit with a high confidence and reported by many studies. And regarding to the aviation and shipping, this is very important. Actually, we in chapter 5, which we are looking for a demand, we found at reducing the aviation or shifting to the train as another alternative option will reduce the greenhouse gas emission. But also this very broadly discussed in a transport chapter, that they bring a new perspective of, not new perspective actually is there, but basically they emphasize more on a new technology in fuel, or a hydrogen one, and the new technologies that they are thinking about the aviation and shipping. So these are things that needs comprehensively the life cycle assessment through all these things, but which from our perspective of the demand side and social science is clear that reducing the air traveling and shipping, and also using the efficient or basically shifting to the renewable would be super helpful. But from the life cycle assessment and from the perspective of the technology, of course, there is a lot of work going on, and we'll report it in a transport chapter. Hope I answered your question. You're muted, Andrew.
I predicted correctly that I would be the first person to fail to unmute myself, and indeed I was. There we go. Thank you so much. That was really, really good. And of course, we always have that kind of challenge, don't we, about whether or not improvements in efficiency can keep up with and outstrip increases in demand, which is one of those big issues. But now let's move over to Doris. Doris, let's hear from you.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Leila, for this really nice summary. I want to pick up exactly at the central point, the focus on demand. And as you said, Leila and Andrew already, the focus on the demand side is what is really special about this IPCC report, of course. And it shows that to understand what is needed, and in fact, I would argue to have any chance at the sustainability transition that we need to understand what drives demand. And now in turn, and very importantly, in my view, understanding demand requires going beyond the individual consumer. It requires that we take the system into view, that we take the relevant political, economic, and societal structures into view. And in fact, today, in our current political economic system, a lot of our demand is production driven. Right? That doesn't mean that consumers don't have needs. They very clearly have needs, but if it was just about satisfying consumers' needs, then we would be focusing much more on services than on products. But the way we do it right now is we take billions of dollars and we take very well-trained psychologists and marketing specialists, and we tell consumers that they want specific products, they want specific satisfiers, right? And we do that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we tell consumers that they should buy more than they need, and in fact, more than they want. And in particular, we persuade them to buy very fuel-intensive products, because very often those are the products that you can make a lot of profit with. And so what I think this IPCC report shows very clearly is that we need to turn the perspective around. We need to ask, what if we allowed consumers to actually consume just as much as they require to satisfy their needs? If we enable them to adopt a lifestyle that is actually in accordance with climate targets, rather than making it so difficult for them to do that? And if we were to ask those questions, what would that entail? It would entail knowing what lifestyle options allow consumers to make the most significant changes to their carbon footprint. It would entail enabling them to choose those lifestyle options. And it would mean that we need to change those broader structures that Andrew and Leila, both of you have already referred to change those political, economic, technological structures so that we actually allow for a provisioning in the interest of need satisfaction, but in the most eco-efficient way. So I would argue this is what research still needs to focus on, and what researchers really need to talk about. We need to talk about what a lifestyle that is in accordance with the climate target, with keeping global warming as close as possible to the 1.5 degree climate target, what that lifestyle would actually look like, and what changes we have to make in our system, in our political and economic systems, in our societal narratives, but also in our technological infrastructure to make such a lifestyle possible. That's what we're trying to do in our project. We started only in the middle of last year, so I don't have results yet, but this is what we aim to do. We will talk to households, we will identify the most impactful lifestyle options, talk to them, what it takes for them to adopt these lifestyle options, what hinders them from doing so, and we'll talk to policymakers and stakeholders about making the necessary changes also to make certain lifestyle options as little impactful, as low carbon as possible. Now, that involves some uncomfortable questions that we have to ask ourselves, and all Andrew and Leila, they shone through what you were talking about already. We have to ask ourselves what an economy would look like in which people are protected against this pressure to consume more than they need, more than they want. We have to ask ourselves how we can use technologies to serve needs and satisfy needs in the most eco-efficient manner. and to actually reduce business incentives to sell as many products as possible. We need to ask ourselves what our democracy has to look like, right? How can we achieve the necessary political changes, given that today we have an overpowering influence of profit-seeking interests in our democracies? And finally, and very fundamentally, we need to ask ourselves, and we need to talk in our societies about a vision of a good life for all within planetary boundaries, right? A vision of a world in which our lifestyles actually align with the Paris climate target. Thank you.
Doris, thank you so much. That's some huge sweeping challenges I see there. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of, for example, how I believe there is currently a live European citizens initiative at the moment to do for the advertising of high carbon goods and services what an earlier regulation did for the advertising of tobacco, for example, from a public health perspective. But I wonder if, just quickly before moving on to Elisabeth, if I could ask you, of all the issues that you've been looking at the moment, is there one thing which has caught your attention, which stands out as being positive and optimistic, that gives you hope?
Well, one thing that gives me hope is that indeed we right now see the most effort and the most concerted discussion and concerted effort forever, right? That we've ever had in the right direction, and that actually ideas of what a good life away from all this material consumption looks like being discussed so much more prominently in societies. And Elisabeth would talk about this, right? Sufficiency popping up in the public discussion in the IPCC report. The IPCC report even mentions upper limits to consumption, right? So I think that very fundamental discussions are moving in a good direction. That gives me hope.
So it all starts with the conversation. So let's keep the conversation going and go over to Elisabeth. Elisabeth.
Yeah, thank you. And especially also thank you to Leila and also Doris. I just thought that Doris has already put up the really big questions resulting from also Leila's input of what will this all mean? What are the implications of it? And I think what I really enjoyed during reading the IPCC report or also listening to the discussion is that I think we are now, from my point of view as a psychologist, finally moving forward to taking the systemic perspective on all of these changes. Because for quite some time, I think the discussion around climate change was a bit like as if the climate were a car that needs to be fixed. And so if we buy the right maintenance part and put them in, then yeah, it will run on electricity and the problem solved, kind of. But what we've seen is, while we made a bit of progress in the last years, I think, although always when the IPCC comes out we realize how bad we are still doing, but nevertheless, is that we see that we need this systemic approach to all of this, so that it really things can work together. And this is also, I also saw that not only Doris brought up this discussion about that the supply side is of course triggering demand, it was also in the chat. And that's, I think the other thing is, all of us, we are to some extent, we are not only on one side of this, we are all of, I mean, we are society, we are also, maybe we are not industry, but we, as researchers, we bring innovation to society, we bring in the new ideas. So we are, all of us are part of the overall system, of course, with different resources and power in this, but nevertheless, so it's also us that we can change it. And with our project, and that's why I'm kind of involved in this today, is we now took out this still small slice that's called sufficiency, or the report speaks of the avoid option in this, so about cutting down, reducing it. And already I think that our project was funded, or that we talk about this, is quite a development. A few years ago, I know that kind of people funding these research projects, politicians left the room once you started about cutting down and sufficiency, because the image was always that this will mean we go back to a forest or a cave and be very poor, and maybe also do not have a lot of emissions, but yeah, kind of the end of the happy life. And I think that's also one of these great things that the report points out, or where you showed that from your recent paper, that there is a good link with well-being and cutting back, reducing romance. So these are not contradictory issues. Yeah, we hope to, of course, to contribute to this debate. We even started after Doris, so even less results. But I think it's that's exactly the path, I think, that we need all of us to move forward, to find out about how these conditions interact. So from like the individuals, the households, single companies, and organized and on municipalities, communities, and then the overall, the big policy, the big industry, and how we can find our ways to really avoid emissions from the beginning and reduce demand. For some of us live in smaller apartments. And what I found but really great is also, on one of your slides, Leila, that it ended saying, of course, we need systemic changes, we need the structural changes, and of course, there is a group of people, and seen worldwide, it's a big group, that still need to catch up, that are not the target of sufficiency measures. That's more, I'm a target of sufficiency measures, probably. Not everyone, but I think from my personal opinion, I think it's the only way how we can make ends meet if we take this pathway.
Elisabeth, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think zeroing in on that key insight that the necessary mitigation pathways are not only compatible with, but supportive of measures that can potentially improve people's well-being, certainly amongst those people in the world who are amongst the higher emitters, the higher consumers. I would venture to say that it's been one of the longest standing challenges of the environmental movement to find a way to sell the idea, to convince people of the idea that less is more. I wonder, from all your work and your research, if you would offer up one insight about how we can shift those aspirational role models so that people aspire to less rather than aspiring to accumulation. What would you say?
Actually, I'm not even sure that we are all striving for so much of accumulation. I think we are. When we look through our lives, we already find a lot of things where the joy is in the small things. And again, if we need recent examples, I think that the pandemic is of course a clear one, where we saw, this is not to say that the pandemic was a great experience, it was not, but where we saw that that many are capable of rearranging their lives, and it's not all of us were suffering from depression. So that you can find, for example, that people are now spending more time in nature next to their home, and realize it can even be exciting.
Thank you. That's a lovely answer. I could almost one that I could have planted. I will mention that there's a series of briefings on insights and lessons from the pandemic going up on the Rapid Transition Alliance website, rapidtransition.org. And while Edouard is speaking, I'll put a link to those into the chat. But let's move on and hear now from Edouard for hopefully some really kind of practical, hands-on advice on how we make these changes. Edouard.
Yes, thanks a lot for inviting me. Good afternoon. So I'm speaking on behalf of INOF, as you have said, the International Network for Sufficiency Research and Policy. Maybe I'll start by a few words about the network, although I guess many of the participants today are members already, probably. So this network was created some years ago with the aim to increase the visibility and networking on sufficiency. So we have now more than 250 members and growing. And we have several activities. One of them is to gather a bibliographical collection on sufficiency. And we have now more than 350 references. So we can note that sufficiency is really becoming a solid stream of research. And what's interesting, all these references come from very various fields. So it can be philosophy, geography, sociology, even marketing. You would be surprised that now there are people in marketing who are really questioning their activity and trying to reinvent what they are doing. So exactly what you said earlier, that we should not just sell products, but think about differently how to live well within planetary limits. Obviously, we are very happy to see that lifestyle changes and sufficiency are increasingly considered and recognized. There's an increasing number of publications, scenarios, including sufficiency. And obviously, the IPCC report is a very significant milestone in that sense. And even more, as we need not only long-term solutions to cut carbon, but also shorter-term solutions. Notably in Europe, where getting rid of fossil fuel is getting a special momentum at the moment, as you know. And so everybody is seeking around solutions and quick fixes. And a lot of it can come from sufficiency. Obviously, we are also still lacking political support for going to lifestyle changes and sufficiency. Although we see also some changes. I don't know if you've seen the International Energy Agency's 10-point plan to cut all use that has been recently published, but it has 90% of sufficiency content. That's really brand new. We had never seen that before. Also, as you may have guessed, I'm French, and in France, recently, a lot of sufficiency-oriented climate scenarios have been developed, even by official authorities. And this has sparked some very interesting debates about how we get to climate neutrality. And this also was really unheard of. And most, if not all of these scenarios come to the conclusion that we cannot make it without sufficiency. So now the question is not, do we need sufficiency, but how do we do it? How do we operationalize sufficiency? So it is obviously the role of research to inform the conditions and best ways of implementing sufficiency and answer all the questions that have already been raised by all of you. And especially to inform the necessary societal changes and enabling policies that were mentioned by Leila. And so in the network, we'll be happy to contribute to the sharing of knowledge and to ideas going in that sense. So for people who would not be already members of the Enough network, unfortunately, we do not have a website yet because we are working with limited resources, but we have a page on ResearchGate. And otherwise, maybe if my email address can be shared in the comment section, then people can contact me, no problem. And maybe I will just conclude by coming back to one of Andrew's question to Doris was, do you think some positive signs and some light at the end of the tunnel? And I'll just mention one example. Obviously, in the last year, it would have been unthinkable to imagine some high-level politicians referring to sufficiency. In France, at the moment, we have national elections, and the first round took place yesterday. And in his speech, our current President Macron, who is also candidate for a second term, used the term energy sufficiency. Probably he doesn't know exactly what he's talking about. Probably he has a different understanding, but it means that there was a sufficient pressure so that it became something that is considered as necessary to quote in an election speech. So we are slowly getting there. And now, of course, we have to use all our brains to tell to these politicians what it means and how they can implement it in a smooth way and with support from the population.
Edouard, that's a fantastic whirlwind tour. Thank you so much. And we would never have guessed that you were French, because your English is so perfect, which is a lot more than can be said for my French. Now, we have had some questions in. So what I'd like to do now is put a couple of quite big questions to all our speakers and give them a chance in turn to answer them. And I think we'll go back and go through the same order that we did last time. And the first one, unsurprisingly perhaps, is that of all the insights that we've heard today, a lot of them seem to be in conflict with the basic touchstone of most political administrations, which is a continuing commitment to orthodox economic growth. So the one question is, how can this be engineered into the political discussion in such a way that governments can actually wrestle with it, deal with its implications, look at the ways in which our economies are addicted to orthodox growth and find out ways out of that. And then the second question, which is a bit more specific, that there is much debate about lifestyle changes for individuals, but we've had a question in about what are the consumption patterns or lifestyle patterns, if you like, at a larger level of large businesses and organizations, and the big office complexes that they built, and how can we begin to engineer changes there as well. So I think I'd like to go back to Leila to begin with, and the big question which will not go away, the growth question.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks all of you with a great speech. Actually, I very much enjoyed, and maybe I also would like to add a couple of other words and then also go to the which is in line with the growth and big growth, basically. As Doris mentioned, I mean, that also we conclude in IPCC, these changes or this transition requires a massive collaboration and cooperation. I mean, individuals alone or governments alone or policy or businesses alone cannot do anything. This is really kind of group efforts, and actually from the all levels of the society, and also not only in one country or one specific region. We do need international cooperation. And that's why, for example, we are saying that this lifestyle change or behavior change alone could not, I mean, alone, of course, with the policy support could be estimated around 5% by 2050. But when we have this infrastructure and the political perspective that Doris mentions, that exists or the system is correct, then we can go much beyond that, and we can reach to our targets. Maybe this is a challenge, but also I make it as a beauty of the research or study is that this topic is very much depends on the context. I mean, not only the regional or geographical context, but also political context and the resource context. Basically, even within one country, each regions could act differently because of the political perspective, because of the sources that they have available, because of the values or culture that the people of that area has, that could be completely different. These are things that we discuss in our chapter in IPCC, that we have actors of the change that is from the individuals started to goes to the NGOs, businesses, and all levels to the high level, which is the governance that putting the policy, but also all different values or meanings or culture that is exists and could act as incentives or nudges to change this basically or to change this behavior, and basically also accelerate this transition to the new style. And actually the pandemic also shows us a very good, it's not a good experience at all for all of us, but shows that when we do need to do the actions, people really stand next to each other and do that. So basically this is the important thing, that we do need as also social cohesion and social intensive to go through that. And the last point actually that comes from the Elisabeth, that she said that maybe sufficiency is just for us. Actually, this is very valid point. I mean, in sufficiency, we had actually this time in SPM as a, we had in a footnote actually the description of the sufficiency is that maybe for global north, or where that we have enough sources, we are saying they're reducing the emissions or reducing the demand and reducing the demand of the materials and products. But in the global south is completely little bit different basically definition, basically providing minimum service demand for them in a way that they using the better energy and have a minimum of the human well-being. So all of them is through the human well-being and the human health. Regarding to the growth and degrowth concept that we are discussing, there is a particular chapter that they are talking about this concept, but I would say that demand side mitigation option, or basically from the social perspective, we are going beyond this, that we are talking about society, we are talking about the human and human well-being, and we are beyond the economical perspective. Of course, we are considering that, but we should think that we are first in that perspective, that we do need to look through the society and social perspective. So basically the world is never stops. We are just growing and growing, but we should make sure that we are going in a right direction to keep this world for our next generation as well. So in summary, we do need strong interdisciplinary multi-level cooperation and international cooperation to transit to the low carbon economy and low demand, basically.
Thank you, Leila. That's fantastic. And in your wonderful answers, you're picking up many additional points which are being raised in the questions. And it does seem quite extraordinary that we're now more than 50 years from when Senator Bobby Kennedy made his famous speech in which he said that growth measures everything in life apart from that which truly matters. Doris, what's your take?
Well, I'll start with the growth question, but I also return to this two sides of deficiency. So I think that the observation that growth is still so enshrined in what our politicians think, but importantly, not only what our politicians think, right? But if I go in our university across the street to the economics department, then it's all about growth. And even in my own discipline, political science, if I look at the political economists, they still think about, well, how can governments improve growth? And you know, for some countries in the world, that's clearly important. But there is no such discipline that systematically and with enough people studies degrowth. It's still a much smaller group. But even here, I do think we can see change. So in Germany, we've just had, indeed by the German Research Association, a post-growth network of scientists funded, right? So this is happening. And now that we are allowed to talk about sufficiency, and we're starting to be allowed to talk about less and limits to consumption, growth is the other side of this, right? So for the longest time, I do think it was the thing that was still taboo. You weren't allowed to talk about giving up this paradigm of growth. But I think we're getting there, where it's more differentiated. Also in the German government, current German government, I would think there is some potential for that. And hopefully then we can make progress. It will have to involve talking about how we organize welfare, what we mean with work, what's the role of employment in providing for welfare at the same time. right? And that then actually already relates to the second question, this role of large organizations and their consumption. Because the lifestyle options to consider, they will have to consider work-life questions, right? How much do we work? How do we work? And so on. And I think that's also, in my personal view, an area where we will see a lot of impact of the pandemic. We're already seeing that in terms of the question of who goes back to the office and who doesn't go back to the office, and actually firms giving up office space, with good and bad sides. I don't want to romanticize that. But what we're also seeing it in terms of how people approach work, and how much they're willing to work, and how much they insist on doing something else besides work in their life, if they can, which again relates back to how are they being paid, right, for work. So I think this whole business work side is really important to include here.
Doris, I wonder if I could just, some of the questions that we're getting in are people wrestling with trying to see what this looks like in detail in our day-to-day lives. And I wonder if just on that last question, that's sort of quite a fundamental one about how we work, because it relates to how much income we have and therefore how much disposable income we have to pay on, to use on consumption. I wonder if specifically is what we're gravitating towards the idea of the norm of a shorter working week, which is perhaps underpinned by some of the sorts of measures we saw demonstrated during the pandemic, where the state becomes a wage payer of last resort, whether that's through providing universal basic services or universal basic income. So a shorter working week with more time for doing things which are not consumption related. Is that the sort of picture that you see?
Absolutely. That's, I think, where we will need to go, in the direction which we will need to go in. Again, let me emphasize, right, our project has just started, so I'm not reporting project results in this regard yet, but I do think that the work spend cycle has to change, and that by working less, by then being reducing consumption accordingly, but also not being forced to organize a lot of consumption, including food, in a very limited time, and all of that. That will be one of the elements of the shift we're going to pursue. Now, having said that, let me emphasize that will also involve questions of distribution of income, right? Because in my income category, I could say I work less and am willing to live with less income. Other people can't do that. Other people have 2-3 jobs to have enough income to feed their family. So obviously that's something to address. So I don't want to sound like too easily saying, oh, let's all work less and have less money. Of course, some people cannot forgo income.
As the epidemiologists Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett say in their book, The Spirit Level, all our problems are much easier to solve in more equal societies. Let's go to Elisabeth and hear your responses.
Yeah, I will just pick up a few of the things, because I think, yeah, we already had these outlines to many of the big debates, etc., and also this question of how do we deal with growth, and it's similar as with the openness for discussing sufficiency. I think there is also increasing movement in this debate, and we see that things like innovation research has taken up mission-oriented strategies, for example. It's also something, when this came up, I wondered, I thought, what do they mean by that? And I realized, okay, before it was economic growth, and now it becomes clear that there's more, because I mean, in the end, yeah, as we see, there's an end to growth and the planet ends. So the concept's not working, but we see the repercussions of this in many debates. And I think what we also need to realize that I think we all sometimes overestimate how many parts of life are actually organized really in this very capitalist system. So we have a number of nations who have a strongly regulated health system, for example. Maybe there's no free market for doctors or something. So there are also examples of more or less working systems following other rules. But coming to how do we actually achieve this? And now I think, of course, Leila is definitely right when she points to interdisciplinariness or international approaches, all of that. But I see as an important driver, I think we have not talked about today, is bottom-up initiatives. And here I'm not only thinking of individuals, who we have some examples also in the chat, how difficult it can be to change your life when you are in kind of a minority with this. But I think a very important role is also municipalities, cities, but also in rural areas, because they often, many countries, they have the power, for example, to shape and influence land use and all of these things. And what we see here is that what we have as humans is that usually social norms work. So if the structures are starting to change, even within the existing system, people also start to organize their life differently. I just to make it very, very specific. I'm living here in a quarter of a city, and many of these principles, so that you can, the supermarket is only 5 minutes away, and all of the things are implemented here. And I now really often see people here walking or cycling to the supermarket, which wouldn't do that if they lived elsewhere. So this is not only the high activist eco something people working, they do it because it's much easier, because by car you have to take a detour and they have to find a parking, but just and then it's normal and easy. And you also see your neighbors with the shopping bag, so it's fine. And this just shows us that I think that, yeah, that there is another field that we can put some hopes on.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Make the good thing easy. It's a good mantra to always have. So we've just got 5 minutes left. I'm just reflecting on the richness of the conversation we've had so far, and the fantastic conversation which has been going on in the chat as well, which we will save. It's the IPCC report this time round. It always makes a good contribution. It's really opened things up by validating this debate, this discussion now about demand curb. So just before we hear from Edouard, we'll have time for just like 1 minute each to round off from all of our speakers. And what I'm going to invite them to do, I'll mention another couple of questions which have come up, but I'd like you just to think for a moment about if you could pick your favorite example of an initiative to curb demand that you'd like to share with us, and then I'll come back to you and we'll go through the same order again. But let's hear first from Edouard very quickly in terms of the last couple of questions. Edouard.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Very briefly, it is true that most politicians today are still seeking traditional growth and asking us to work more, consume more, produce more. But a very clear statement from IPCC and other reports is that the business as usual growth is condemned. So we have to forget about it, and we have to think about how we change. And we have to be honest that sufficiency and climate change mitigation means the degrowth of some things and sectors. And this has to be prepared. It also means a fundamental change in business models. And it's interesting to see that there is an emerging research on alternative business models, especially how can companies provide sufficiency services. That means helping answering people's need with much less material, energy, products. And it's really interesting and very promising strands of research in these really new ways of thinking about business development and business models. So we can have some hope there that we are able with all our brains to invent a new economy that would answer people's need with a different way of growing and developing.
That's fantastic, Edouard. Thank you so much. And I will also just remind people that in the chat, there's been lots and lots of links posted about how we can practically follow up on this and get involved in campaigns and see the background research for that sits behind all of this. Now, we've literally now got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to be really horrible to our speakers and challenge them to sum up in about 30 seconds each, but making sure that you include at least one example of your favorite demand curve. Let's go straight to Leila. Leila.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a very difficult question. If I want to just bring one example, there's 1,000 of examples I can say, but maybe in summary, I can say it. We as a consumers are beyond consumers. We can do a lot of changes. And then, for example, now I'm living far away from where I'm doing, where is my institute? I'm actually so far away from here. I should take a car, of course, if I need to do, but I'm not doing that. I'm taking the public transport, or sometimes when the weather is very nice, I'm cycling, which is my favorite job to do. And this brings a lot of norms here actually, and many of people, we are becoming a group of people that cycle together. And this is something that I would say that we should not stand others do something for us. We should start for ourselves and try to bring this in upper levels, and everyone could do that. And thanks again for the opportunity.
So all praise the social contagion effect. Doris.
Well, I just jump onto that and say, I think what we need to do most of all, at least that's what I always tell my students, right, is get into the political, in the societal debate about this, yeah, and make sure your voice is heard, and try to change things that way. And I'm going to destroy your rules, Andrew, and say a second thing, but it's totally unrelated. But what I would really like to see is like a TV series, right? Like a sitcom of a family living a sufficient lifestyle, or living with consumption in a world with upper and lower consumption limits. So that we actually develop as a society a vision of what such a life can be like, and that it can be really good.
It's funny you should say that. I happen to know a program maker who is working on one of those as we speak. So with even fewer seconds left, Elisabeth.
Really short, my favorite is shared space. Shared space in the cities, in the countries where we allow people to use public space to just for leisure time, to make music, to bring their own food from home and sit there with others, or shared space in terms of co-housing projects, because I think it's also something, it often makes people happy if they found the right project and they can reduce space of living, still have visitors, and feel safer also often.
That's wonderful. Literally music to my ears. And we give the last word to Edouard.
Thanks a lot. I think what opinion polls show is that there are a growing number of people who want to do something and want to do their share. But as you said in the beginning of the workshop, they receive contradictory messages. And I think it's really important that we stop this nonsense of sending them one message and then the opposite, because that's the best way of really hindering any behavioral change. So we have to work with advertisers, marketers, and so on, and politicians to really get everyone to send the same message.
Thank you so much, Edouard. And that's a perfect nudge for me to say that in May, if you go to the badverts.org website, you'll see a note about an ad-free cities conference in London. If you're in London, come along to it. There'll be workshops looking at all of these things. I'd like to thank also Haliki and Leon, who've been sitting in the background making today's webinar work. And a huge thanks to all our speakers, to Leila, to Doris, to Elisabeth and Edouard. This is an issue which is only going to get bigger. Please share the links, please get involved, and please read the IPCC report and talk about it and do it. And thank you very much.
And thank you for the wonderful moderation.
Yes, thank you so much.
Exactly. And
bye, everybody.
Beyond Leila, thanks to all the people at IPCC and all the reviewers and contributors who managed to get us there, and really congratulations, because that was not so
Exactly.
easy.
Yeah, it was very hectic time actually for all of us, but I'm happy that it's out and all are happy with that. Thanks a lot for everyone. Thanks, and nice to see you all.
Thank you all. Cheerio. You can see we didn't rehearse the very last minute, so that was your authentic moment of open discussion. But thank you all now, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.